My name is Julie Bion, and on behalf of the many organizations collaborating to sponsor this event, I welcome you to this extraordinary evening celebrating voice and collaboration. It's the intersection of these sponsoring organizations that brings us here tonight to celebrate a particular collaboration of individuals and organizations that assisted the late Neil Selinger in finding his voice and making it heard. The primacy of patient voice is foremost in the Mac Angels Foundation, which supports patients with ALS and their families in a multitude of ways, ranging from individual support to collaborating with other organizations to bring programs such as this into the community. The same can be said of another sponsor this evening, the Westchester End of Life Coalition, which strives to ensure that Westchester residents have access to the information and care that supports them with dignity at the end of life. And patient voice is central to Columbia University's program in narrative medicine, which uses literature to promote greater humanism and humanity in medical practice and to assist those dealing with illness gain new perspectives and meaning about that experience. And of course, the writing program here at Sarah Lawrence is all about helping individuals find their voice. I first came to Sarah Lawrence 10 years ago as a graduate student in the health advocacy program, where attentiveness to patients' voice is at the heart of health advocacy. The experience and perceptions of real people as they struggle with issues related to their health and their health care. And we will hear about those so eloquently detailed by Neil Selinger. Neil Selinger retired from his law practice in his 50s and pursued his dream of becoming a published writer by enrolling at the Writing Institute here at Sarah Lawrence College. Just as he was beginning his new career, he was diagnosed with ALS, better known to most as Lou Gehrig's disease. During the last 10 months of his life, his body immobilized by amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Neil Selinger and his collaborators showed what one man could do to tell his story. Just as he was finding his voice as a writer, he progressively lost his speaking voice and his ability to move. In spite of this, and with the assistance of some of the people you will hear from this evening, his first book was published earlier this year. He then relied upon computer-assisted technology and the commitment of Dr. Dana Gage to craft his words into an inspiring and thought-provoking series of essays, which you'll hear. A physician and master's candidate in narrative medicine at Columbia University, Dana Gage was the perfect collaborator to assist him in putting on paper his stunning perceptions of a life course that was unexpected, unwelcome, and amazingly transforming. Advocacy can take many forms, and in this case, Neil Selinger's health advocate, Heidi Weiss, found a way to help him realize his dream by collaborating with a fellow health advocacy program graduate, Pat Stanley, who is on the faculty of the narrative medicine program at Columbia. Pat approached one of her students about working with Neil, and fortunately for everyone, Dana Gage said yes. Dana will tell you about her work with Neil Selinger and will be joined in reading some of his essays about life with ALS by several individuals who helped make his dream of becoming a writer a reality. She will then be joined by science writer Jamie Talon, who will interview Dana about this collaboration, and then they'll take questions from you in the audience. At the end of the evening, I invite you all to join us outside the theater in the lobby for a reception, where you'll have a chance to meet all of the presenters and representatives of the sponsors of this evening. And now you've heard way too much of my voice, and allow me to introduce you to who will be speaking Neil Selinger's wonderfully eloquent words. Heidi Weiss is a social worker and a health advocate who coordinates the Pathways to Care program at Westchester Jewish Community Services, which supports individuals and families facing debilitating and life-threatening illnesses. Heidi supported the Selinger family throughout Neil's illness. Steve Lewis, a freelance writer and author of several books, has been on the faculty at the Writing Institute at Sarah Lawrence since 2005. Neil first enrolled in Steve's creative nonfiction workshop in 2008, and over the next 2.5 years wrote most of his first published memoir, A Sloan Product. After he was no longer able to attend classes at the Institute, Steve and several students formed the Bella Via Writers Salon and continued to meet at the Sellinger's warm and welcoming home until this past June. Rima Grad also tells stories on paper, but instead of typing her narratives, she uses colored pencil, crayon, oil pastel, and photographs. A Westchester-based artist, Ms. Grad's monoprints, mixed media collages, and handmade books have been exhibited throughout the United States. Rima and Neil Sellinger were married for 23 years, and together they raised 3 daughters. Dr. Dana Gage has been a practicing physician for 30 years and a writer for even longer. She has completed 3 novels and is currently finishing her master's in narrative medicine. For 10 months, she spent almost every Wednesday with Neil and his family while he completed his essays about ALS. It was her great joy to be part of this process. The essays you are about to hear and the collaborations that enabled them are a celebration of what is possible, even at the end of life, and reminds us all to live until we die. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rima Grad, Steve Lewis, Heidi Weiss, Dana Gage, and the late Neil Sellinger.
Good evening. Can everybody hear me all right? I'm very happy to be here. I thank Julie Bayan for all her efforts in making this evening come alive, and all of you for coming out on a Tuesday evening to Bronxville. It's my first time here. I found it. In April, I went to Iowa to speak at the literature conference there. Neil and I put together a program, and unfortunately he couldn't come because he was not able to negotiate the trip. But at that time, I began to understand how much he probably would have wanted to be there, because one of the suggestions he made is that I should take a ventriloquist dummy with me and pretend it was him and talk for him. Instead, I chose to honor him with an empty chair, and that empty chair is here with us tonight. So I'm sure, since he knew this program was going to happen, and he was so thrilled about it, that he is with us in spirit. When I was approached to speak of my work with Neil, I did it with his blessing. On our panel here are the people who actually helped make this collaboration possible. You heard a little bit about them from Julie, and they're each going to add their own special selection of Neil's essays, which mean the most to them. They've each picked them, and I think because of that, it's going to be even more meaningful. I kind of got all the credit for this. You know, it's my name on the page, but these are the people who were with Neil all the way along. So I couldn't stand on this stage alone. I want to thank all those sponsoring agencies. This work has been unique to me in my career as a physician and also in my work in the narrative medicine program, and I'm happy to say that some of our faculty members, some of my favorite faculty members, are here tonight with us, so thank you. We're also joined by a remarkable woman, Jamie Talon, who will be interviewing me a little bit later and will be with us for the question and answer session as well. So I invite you all to just sit back and enjoy the words and the associations that Neil has shared about his life and about his life with ALS. But just as I touched his writing, he touched mine. And I'm going to start tonight with an essay that was inspired by the work that we did together. And I called it A Lawyer's Scribe. I was the physician. He called himself a recovering lawyer. We might as well have been from different planets. But we didn't need to be friends. He needed someone to type for him. Our arrangement was artificial, mutable. And if it didn't work, I could always walk away. He couldn't walk at all. We made up our own rules. I was a physician, but not his physician. I was a writer, but I typed his words, not mine. We met once a week at his home. We arranged his desk. He maneuvered his wheelchair as I struggled to get comfortable in a chair melded to the previous version of his body. The family hovered. The dog lay next to us as we worked. Meticulous and with a memory honed on briefs and torts, he had his essays completed in his mind before I arrived. Then he dictated and I typed. A parallel story was always running through my mind as I listened and typed his words. It was like a war. Was it going to be my story or his story? Sometimes my words ended up on the page and I had to erase them. I stayed quiet except for the most innocent of questions. Then we proofed. We had not yet found our joint sense of humor. I won't go on the ventilator, he told me shortly after we began working together. He reiterated this in an essay about not wanting to be more machine than man. He also said he would not want to live if he could not eat, but he got the peg tube, just in case. I took it in stride. I had seen it all before, the bargaining, what becomes acceptable in the struggle to live, what indignities people will withstand when their options get fewer and fewer. He was a youngish man, after all, and had so much to lose. By the third week, I was in tears. I'm not sure what broke through my defenses. His smile in the face of adversity, his determination, his intense love for his family, his quick wit, his intelligence, his love of the written word. I had seen patients with ALS, studied their lack of motor neurons under the microscope, but now I was right there, up close, not a physician's distance away, listening as his words imprinted on the page, not by his hand, but mine. I felt all kinds of emotions, that it wasn't fair, that I hated this disease, that I didn't know how he could go on knowing he would leave it all behind. It broke my heart. It made me angry. I cried from the physician frustration against an overpowering and unfixable disease. I cried at the injustice of it all, and because he wasn't taking time to feel sorry for himself. I asked him if it was all right if I cried from time to time. He said yes, so we were off and running, so to speak. I began to look forward to our sessions, our relationship enlarging, he getting physically smaller and more inert. We found mutual areas of interest and scorn, and we laughed a lot. His speech became garbled. Even by staring at his lips, I sometimes could not understand him. He began to have episodes of coughing. Once I helped dislodge a piece of turkey out of his trachea. It wasn't part of our arrangement. I was there. I knew what to do. It worked out. The last 2 words I ever heard him speak to me were the 2 I most treasured. Thank you. We trudged on. His first book was published, an autobiography of his younger years growing up in the wilds of New Jersey. He had a book party. By then, he couldn't speak at all. His writers group and I read some of his work. He got a standing ovation. We started using an eye gaze device, dueling computers side by side, he in his chair and me at the counter looking over his shoulder at the screen. It was slow and tedious. We barely made 400 words a session. Sometimes I guessed his words before he had finished typing, saving time and energy. He sweated with exertion. Sometimes we stopped early so he could watch the Yankee game. His essays became more intense. The deep thoughts and feelings were there just below the surface. I had them too. But mostly, every Wednesday on the way to his house, I prayed. I hope he didn't die and they forgot to tell me. I was relieved every week not to see mourners' cars lining the street. How can you do it, people would ask me. By that time, I could not imagine not doing it. We had a goal. He wanted to finish his essays. I wanted to help him. I promised him I would be there till the end, and secretly prayed that the end would be a long time coming. He struggled on. He was becoming my friend. Our friendship deepened each week as I tried to bring him something from the outside world, something to keep him connected. I don't know the strength and willpower it took for him to finish. He was clear that each day it was harder and harder to want to go on. While he began closing down, I was trying to keep him open and producing, alive. In June, he said he was done. He had finished what he wanted to say. He had made his decision not to go on. I was bereft. We spent our last session finishing his obituary and then chatting and making silly jokes. He explained about the double switch and the infield fly rule. Then we said goodbye. I had experienced what few physicians, few people who are not forced to, had experienced. I had become friends with a dying man. It was my great honor. I never met someone more alive, even as he was dying. About 6 months after I met Neil, he said he only had about 5,000 words left to do on his essays. So I told him, no. I have a list for you of things to finish. By that time, I was no longer this quiet little girl that was sitting next to him typing, but I felt strong enough in our relationship to kind of give him a little bit of irritation from time to time. So I gave him a list of topics that I wanted him to write about, and this is one of them. It turned out to be one of my favorites. It's called What I Miss. I miss putting on my running shoes while the dog jumps on me in anticipation of our morning exercise. I miss peeling off my sweat-soaked workout clothes. I miss my Saturday morning errands to the supermarket and dry cleaners. I miss being able to leave the house on a minute's notice. I long to be able to surf channels without assistance or to answer the phone or dial a number. I watch my daughters stand in front of the refrigerator while they peruse its contents and think, that used to be me. I miss scratching an inch, blowing my nose, rolling over in bed, sleeping on my stomach, and pushing the dog off my feet while I sleep. I miss flipping the pages of newspapers and magazines aimlessly as I wait for something to grab my attention. I miss doing the acrostic puzzle without having someone else fill in the squares. I stopped playing guitar years ago, but it galls me that I have 3 guitars sitting in our basement playroom that I cannot play even if I wanted to. I miss singing and whistling. I miss cooking for my family, whether it was one of my quickly thrown together weeknight meals or my Sunday afternoon extravaganzas. I miss drinking scotch in the winter and martinis in the summer, or that first sip of a really good bottle of wine. I miss drinking without a straw, tipping my head back and gulping. I miss large bites and overstuffed sandwiches. I miss not having to worry about choking. I miss loading and unloading our dishwasher and lecturing my family about the inefficiencies of their loading skills. I miss being referred to as the doctor of the dishwasher. My mantra was, there's always room for one more plate. I miss doing the chores about which I used to complain, taking out the garbage, changing light bulbs, sorting the recycling, shoveling snow. I miss running my fingers through Rima's hair, stroking her arm, caressing her cheeks, chasing her up the stairs. More than anything, I miss tiptoeing down to our kitchen on a Sunday morning, sitting quietly with a cup of tea and the weekend papers, comforted in the knowledge that my wife and daughters are safe and warm in their beds with hardly a care in the world. I think Heidi's up next. It's Heidi Weiss, Neil's social worker and friend.
My essay is entitled Happiness. Recently, a friend of mine was describing how she perceived me back in the days before I was diagnosed with ALS. She told me that I was hard to read often and seemed distant. It was a fair assessment. I know that I was usually lost in my own little world and often not interested in the people around me. I suppose that many people interpreted my affectations as an indication of emotional detachment or even unhappiness, but that was not always the case. I had my share of sorrow and disappointment, and I certainly made my share of mistakes, yet my life was full of moments of great joy. I was lucky as a boy to watch Mantle and Ford, as a young man to watch Munson and Guidry, and in the middle age to travel in the elegance of Jeter and Rivera. I have known the exhilaration of shooting a jump shot with a hand in my face and watching the high arc of a ball descend into the net with a thwack. I have paddled down the Colorado River, jumped off cliffs into turquoise pools, rappelled down sheer rock faces, and survived 36 hours by myself during an outward-bound wilderness course. I have snorkeled over pristine reefs, swam with sea turtles and dolphins, and rode waves in several oceans. I mastered the zen of long-distance running. There was the pure bliss of the first time I kissed my wife as we leaned against her orange Honda Civic on West 92nd Street, and when she finally succumbed to my relentless pursuit. There were our trips before children to the capitals of Europe and a tropical paradise. The moments at the births of each of my 3 daughters when I realized that they were healthy and strong. The family trips, the noise and chatter of Sunday evening dinners, or just watching my girls blossom into independent young women. I've experienced the sheer energy of more than 200 Bruce Springsteen concerts, encompassing over 40 years of stalking the man. In the early 1900s, my wife and I held his legs as he jumped into the crowd at a show in New Jersey, and last October, I finally attained my dream of meeting the man, along with my family, backstage at Giant Stadium. I saw Hendrix and Clapton in their primes. The moments of joy, however, alternated with periods of nagging self-doubt, stress and aggravation, sleepless nights, and a lingering feeling of ennui that I could never explain. As peculiar as it may sound, it was only when I got sick that these feelings of unrest and dissatisfaction that gnawed at me began to dissipate. In the last 2 years, I have finally stripped away the emotional numbness that was my principal defense. I now allow myself to feel, whether it is the pain, sorrow, and sadness of my disease, the prospect of a beautiful morning, or especially the warmth of listening to the music of my family's laughter. I am happier than I have ever been. I have learned to accept love and kindness in a way that I never did before. I revel in the simple accomplishments. Sometimes the satisfaction of creating a well-turned sentence is almost more than I can bear.
This is called The Passage of Time. There's an epigraph from James Taylor. The secret of life is enjoying the passage of time. I have to promise you at the outset that there's the first image here you will never forget. 10 inches. That is my view of the outside world. The 10-inch space between the bottom of the window shade and the sill. The slight vista I can make out as I lie propped up in bed in the temporary quarters my wife Rima and I are occupying while the contractors work to make our house barrier-free. Once Rima helps me to settle in for the night, I cannot move. But my head is at the correct angle to watch the changing light over Villa Lane as it filters through the mullion panes that are exposed below the coral-colored accordion shade. A large hemlock stands just beyond the front corner of our house. The tree we refuse to cut down despite the rants of our obsessive next-door neighbor about too much shade being cast on his lawn. Its drooping pine green branch occupies a portion of my line of sight. Shaped like the wing of a giant condor, it flaps in rhythm with the wind, my personal anemometer by which I gauge the strength of the nighttime breezes. In the distance, the leafless limbs of the neighborhood oaks and maples stretch upward to the night sky like skeletal fingers in an X-ray. I wake periodically and monitor the progress of the night by the hue of the backdrop of the tree's silhouettes, the amber glow of the streetlight at 3 a.m., the deep blue of pre-dawn, Homer's rosy-fingered dawn, and the yellow fire glow of the sun clearing the rooftops. Before I was sick, my wakefulness tortured me as I tossed and turned. I was ready to jump out of my skin as I pondered the 101 tasks that awaited me in the office. But now, I am content to stare out through the narrow portal while I listen to the shallow breathing of my wife and the dog lying across the foot of our bed, their rhythmic ins and outs synchronized like a pas de deux. My mind no longer races. Instead, it moves in slow motion as I watch the light and anticipate simple joys that await me in the morning. Rima's good morning kiss, a warm shower, breakfast, and the New York Times, my daughter's smiling faces. I have learned to just be. The rest of my day is not much different, only the venue changes. I sit at the head of our kitchen table, which affords a view through a bay window of the massive oak that dominates our small backyard. My former kinetic self would not understand the pleasures I derive from staring quietly at my newly limited world, or the small acts that are highlights of the afternoon. A visit from a friend, a well-made sandwich, our teenager returning from school, hearing Rima laugh, reading and rereading a paragraph I wrote, taking a nap with the dog nestled beside me. When we gather for dinner, I stare furtively at the faces of my family, trying to store each detail in my brain so I can summon the images during another bout of sleeplessness. Soon it will be time to start the process of getting me ready for bed, a production that constantly expands in both time and effort. As Rima swings my legs onto the bed, I am overcome with satisfaction. I have made it through another day.
Red-haired girl with crayon. Begin then with the crayon, an authentic Crayola orange crayon nestled between her thumb and forefinger, orange like the waves of her hair that fell across her eyes as she leaned over her blank piece of construction paper. Kneeling on the linoleum floor of the small room she shared with her older brother, she studied the new crayon, its tip evenly pointed, the orange paper wrapped neatly enfolding the shiny wax cylinder. She opened and closed the top of the box of 8 crayons again and again, trying to shake the disbelief, trying to convince herself that this perfect set of colors was hers and hers alone. They lived in city housing, one of a series of 6-story red brick apartment buildings in Long Island City. Her father worked for the post office. Her mother was a secretary. Most afternoons, a neighbor looked after her and her brother. Other than when she was allowed to go down to the playground of the complex, she kneeled in her room and drew. The box of crayons was a gift from her father, a glint of recognition of her special talent. She carefully replaced the orange crayon and gently lifted its red neighbor from the box. Roy G. Biv. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, just like she learned in school. She let the tip flow across the paper, adding pressure to darken the lines, turning the edge to create shading and contour. Over time, her Crayola collection expanded, from the box of 8 to boxes of 16 and 32, and finally to the grandest of all, 64 crayons, standing in rows like trees in a brightly colored forest, a sharpener built in the side of the box. As she entered her teens, she moved on to colored pencils and charcoal and graphite. After she begged and begged her parents to let her take some classes at the Art Students League in Manhattan, where she honed her technique for life drawing and still life. But her parents never fully embraced her gift, always wondering how she would be able to survive as an artist. When she called from college and announced that she was majoring in printmaking, Her mother's only response was to suggest that she'd better get a teaching license too. Years later, after all the drawings and etchings and linoleum cuts and woodblock prints, after all the studio classes and workshops and the design jobs to pay the bills, after all those years living the artist's life, after she was pursued by and finally agreed to marry a lawyer, so foreign to her world, she had a daughter. They would kneel together on the floor of the den, pieces of construction paper spread in front of them. Her daughter had her own box of crayons now, 8 jumbo-sized Crayolas, supposedly easier for tiny hands to grip. But she could not resist carefully removing each one from the box, lifting it with thumb and forefinger and placing it in front of her daughter, then showing her how to hold it, how to make lines and curves and circles that covered page after page. When her second daughter was born, she kneeled and drew with her too. Her 2 daughters are nearly grown now, grown enough that they no longer want to sit and draw with their mother. She spends her days in her studio, manipulating and arranging tiny pieces of paper into strange and wonderful collages. But each night, before she goes to sleep, she takes out her notebook and her colored pencils and a crayon or 2 and kneels on the bed next to her husband and their sleeping dog. She holds the tip of a crayon to the page and she draws. I'm going to read a second essay. Rima and Neil. We come from a butcher shop and a poultry farm, the post office and a warehouse. We come from Hungary and White Russia, Queens and New Jersey, Brooklyn and Westchester. We come from the Weavers and Pete Seeger, Broadway musicals and Lawrence Welk. We come from the classrooms of Buffalo and Morningside Heights and the marches and barricades of the 60s. We come from the artist's studio and the courtroom. We are children and parents, parents and children. We are paintings and books, jazz clubs and museums. We are Mets and Yankees, R&B and rock and roll, coffee and tea, Facebook and the New York Times, crosswords and acrostics, jigsaw puzzles and Scrabble. We are the couple swirling our drinks while we listen to the bartender. We are the fear of facing the blank page and the joy of filling it. We are the one that understands the other. We are clinging to each other as tightly as we can. We are going for a walk with the dog, unleashing her on the trail, even if it is against the rules. We are going to stroll hand in hand once more in an ancient piazza, even if only in our dreams. We are going to fight back the tears as we realize our girls are now women. We are going to reclaim the past and finally set it free. We are going to open the windows wide, put our arms around each other, and spit in the face of the hurricane bearing down on us.
Well, you've heard a little bit about what Neil's thoughts were, but one thing that had troubled him for quite some while was who he really was as a person. And he began to explore that in his writing after spending much of his working life as a lawyer. One of the essays that I think he was most proud of was one called Identity Crisis, and that's what I'm going to read now. He also starts off with a quote from Pete Townsend, "Who are you? I really want to know. Call me anything you want, just not late for dinner." That was one of my favorite quips as a boy. There were others, such as, "What's your name? Puddin' tame, ask me again and I'll tell you the same." I was infatuated with fast-talking smart alecks like Groucho Marx, Phil Silvers, Abbott and Costello, and Bugs Bunny. The irony escaped me at the time. Not only was I too timid to employ these types of witticisms, but I failed to realize that the jokes I enjoyed the most were about identity. Yet I had no idea who I was. As a boy, I was content to let others define me. Comments like, "He's such a good boy," or "He's so nice and polite," seemed to suffice even though the speaker knew nothing about me. That was a pattern not easily broken. When I read Shakespeare's The Comedy of Errors in college, my professor pointed out that what was on the surface a farce about 2 sets of identical twins was in truth a discourse on the meaning of identity. I was able to understand that this was a theme which ran through most literature, but I did not apply the lesson to myself. I continued to let others define me. I was the good son, the A student, the responsible husband and father, the loyal employee, and the kind-hearted employer. As a lawyer, I had chosen a profession in which I needed to find a voice. But even though I uttered the words, they actually belonged to my clients. I was too busy acting out the roles that others cast for me that I never took the time to ask, who am I? It was only in my 50s that I began to ask that question. I decided to leave my career behind in order to find out who I really am. I dabbled in many things. I soon discovered that I was more complicated than the labels others had given me. Yes, I was good and responsible, but at the same time, I could be selfish and uncaring. I was smart, but sometimes I lacked common sense. I was egalitarian, but also an elitist. I began to write and seek a genuine voice of my own. For a year, I experimented with my writing style as I tried to unlearn the lessons of 31 years of legal writing. Then the symptoms started. As my muscles weakened, my writing became stronger. As I slowly lost my speech, I gained my voice. As I diminished, I grew. As I lost so much, I finally started to find myself. So who am I? Call me Neil. Thank you all.
Jamie Talon knew something of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis since her early days, circa the 1980s, as a young science reporter at Newsday, a daily newspaper on Long Island. She specialized in all things brain. The first ALS patients she met were on a health portal on Prodigy, and that tells you how long ago it was. Jamie has taken her role as an educator of neuroscience pretty seriously. She saw in her 25-year Newsday career something more than just sharing information. She saw the challenge of balancing news with hope and gaps in knowledge with an inevitable end. ALS taught her about frustration and triumph. She says that she had never known such courage as when she sat opposite an ALS patient who had lost their voice to this disease. But there they were, using their eyes to run a computer that helped tell their story. And tonight, we met another writer who sat across from another ALS patient to tell his story. Writers, Jamie has always said, have a duty to listen and report, and that is what Dana has done so beautifully. In addition to her tenure covering the brain for Newsday, Jamie has written for dozens of other newspapers and magazines. She's authored 2 books, and for the fun of it, got a master's in public health. She raised 3 children and is happy that 2 of them have entered science. 3 years ago, Jamie left Newsday to become a science writer at a research institute and began work on narrative medicine at a medical school at Hofstra that just opened its doors this past summer. Jamie is an assistant professor of science education and has just launched a literary journal for the School of Medicine and the health system where she works. In everything she does, Jamie is committed to people. She sees that as her primary job in life.
Pick this up. Can everybody hear? Hi. That was great. Thank you so much for reading and sharing, and the humility that took place on this stage is is really just inspiring. So thank you. So what I'm going to do is what I've done my whole life, and I'm going to show you what few people get to see in what I do, and that is ask questions to a doctor. And tonight we're going to have a little discussion about who Dana is and how she came on this extraordinary journey with Neil and Neil's family. So, and then what we're going to do is open up the discussion to all of you and hear your stories and why you're here, and then we'll close and we can all have some tea and cookies. I just have to apologize to Neil because I didn't know him, but I'm afraid he wouldn't like me. I'm the only person who's fallen asleep at a Bruce Springsteen concert.
But hate you.
So Neil, I'm so sorry.
He hates you.
He hates me. I knew that. I knew it. I knew it. Well, I'm sorry. And I promise in the next 45 years of my life, I'll try it again and see if I can do it. So Dana, thank you so much for this. And Dana and I actually had dinner together, so we had a great dinner. So it's just, this is an extension of our Q&A. Okay. So why don't we talk about how you, as a physician, kind of put that aside to have a different kind of relationship with a patient. I know you mentioned it a little, but if you could go a little deeper than that.
Well, I think this was an experiment for both of us. Neil was looking for, can I just turn a little bit?
Absolutely.
I don't like to be pointing it away from the audience. Neil was looking for someone to type for him. He had gotten to the point where it was really just about one finger hunt and peck. And through my wonderful faculty member, Pat Stanley, who's here with us tonight, she made contact with Heidi and asked me would I be willing to see if I could be of service in helping him write his story or his essays or his book. And as a writer myself, I felt like I couldn't imagine anything more frustrating or painful than to have stories to tell and not be able to write them down. And I think that's what made me want to do this.
Did it change, listening to Neil's stories and sort of writing his voice, did it change how you approached patients in your world?
Yes. I've always sort of thought of myself as a pretty good listener, but in this situation, it was really a imperative that I not interrupt his train of thought at all. He wrote these, as I mentioned, in his head while he was not sleeping at night, and which was remarkable. One of the remarkable things about Neil was that rather than give into his disease, he sought creative ways of still doing what he wanted to do in spite of all the things that he couldn't do. So he would have this all in his mind and dictate it as fast as I could type. And so it forced me to really, really say nothing, which is really hard for me. Really, Craig can tell you. And yet I had this parallel story running in my mind, and I had these physicians' eyes happening at the same time. And so for me, it was like taking all the different parts of me and utilizing it in a totally new way, and realizing that so much of what we know about the patients is really there if we just stop and listen to what they have to say and not interrupt them, even though sometimes it seems like you might run out of time or they're never going to get to the point, or just listening is a learned skill, and it really helped hone that skill for me.
Have you used it in your own relationship with your patients outside of this?
I think so. My office was always sort of a little crazy place where people would come and tell their stories, and sometimes I would tell my stories, and we'd complain about our kids. And, you know, there was always sort of a free-flowing kind of discussion going on. What I found was that it created a very relaxed environment for the patients. And even though, you know, physicians think they're doing everything right, and why wouldn't the patients feel comfortable, and of course they're going to tell you everything, and that's really not true at all. And one of the most, I think, startling things for me was a woman that I had as a patient for 7 years, when one day she just suddenly blurted out, "I had a son, you know." And so we all think we're listening, and we all think we're creating a quiet place for people to say whatever they want, but there's always more to the story.
I like what Julie said before, that, you know, we lose this sometimes, but I think experiences like this for Neil and for his family and for you, perhaps, we really get to see how we have to live. We have to live today. And I think that he said that, you know, that he now sees the little things in his daughter's laughter, and do you think that seeing that up close and personal outside of your doctoring, has that had an effect on you?
I think that was one of the most moving parts of this. This is a man who adored his family. You only had to see his wife or daughter come into the room, and his face would just brighten up with this huge smile. And I thought, my goodness, he loves these women. You know, these women are everything to him. And how lovely that is to see someone who's so open about that. I never knew Neil other than when he was disabled. So I don't know how his personality changed. But I also know that you can't just invent that personality. That's got to be what was there all along. And he was lucky that he got a chance to experience who he really was before he died.
That day, the day that you shared with us that you knew it was going to be your last day together as writer, patient, doctor, what was it? I mean, you know, you kind of touched on it, but you knew as you were leaving that day that it was over. Saying goodbye.
As much as I imagined it, I couldn't have imagined it the way that it was. And I think he was very good to me in the fact that he wrote to me ahead of time and told me that he had made his decision and his choice, so that I wouldn't be surprised when I got there. And he left the choice up to me whether I would come one last time. But I had promised him I would be there till the very end. And then I thought, how can I walk in that room? How can I let go of this? This had become so meaningful to me. And I wasn't sure that I could do it. I wasn't sure that I had the courage to say goodbye to him after I had shared such intimate thoughts. And I kind of felt like I was his privacy. You know, when you have ALS and you can't do anything for yourself, you can't blow your nose, you can't wipe your eyes, you can't go to the bathroom by yourself, you have no privacy at all. Someone is always there with you. And I thought, I was his privacy. And that was a very special kind of thing. And I knew he had really struggled over this decision, and we had talked about it and argued about it. And then suddenly, kind of, my doctordom came back to me a little bit. And I said, what do I need to do to get in that door and to not make it burdensome to him? And I realized that all I had to do was show up and just treat it like any other day, and tease him a little bit. And I did. I said, I suppose now I'll never get to know what the, double switch is all about, because we used to talk about baseball. And so that's what we did, and we had a really wonderful last session together.
Was that the last time you saw him?
That was the last time I saw him. It was about 10 days before he died, I think.
So he worked up to the end.
I was not going to let him quit.
And now, what are your hopes for yourself as a writer and yourself as a doctor?
Well, I really, I would love to write more about this experience. I would love to use it as a way of encouraging physicians. You know, physicians are really cowards when it comes to a lot of emotional stuff. I can say that and get away with it because I am one. We hide behind the nurses, and we walk in the room real quick, and then we walk out, and we sit at the desk, and we scribble. But the real reward is when you can get close to a patient, no matter what they're going through, and somehow share it with them in whatever way they're willing to share it with you.
Have you used writing with your patients?
Yes. Some of them are remarkably resistant to that idea. Others are very receptive. And I think it's a wonderful tool to get people to examine issues that they're really afraid to talk about.
Great. Should we open up to questions in the audience? Just, if you could just raise your voices a little loud. Yes, okay.
Well, that's how I thought about it. Okay. He didn't have a word, you know, if you have a diary, for instance, you write in it and you lock it up and nobody gets to see it. So he couldn't do that. The only way he could do it is if someone actually typed the words for him. I was kind of a neutral machine that I had to listen to the words, but they were his words, and so I tried to treat it as if I wasn't there. And this way, it went into his computer, it was there for him, and if he didn't want to share it, which of course he did share it with his family, he didn't have to. So it was a way for him to create a special place for his thoughts that other people would not necessarily have access to. I mean, that's how I thought of it.
Does that answer? Any questions, comments? Yes?
What was your editorial role with Neil and his poems? You know, in addition to helping him physically write the words that he had in his head down, did you have to give and take editorially?
Not initially. I got a little braver about that as I went along and would tell him when I didn't like a sentence. And then he would come back at me and say, well, Steve, the writing instructor, would say, he likes it this way. And I'd say, well, you don't have to do everything Steve says.
But you have to do everything you say.
Or we'd fight over grammar sometimes, and one of our big arguments was over the word tracheostomy, which I said had an S in it, and he said it didn't have an S in it, and he said, see, spell check says it doesn't have an S. So, you know, we bickered, but those were his words. I did not, I changed things when my head kind of took things and ran with them, but I had to erase them. You know, I would threaten him that I wouldn't write what he wanted me to, but I never did.
So it wasn't your voice, it was his voice.
No, it was his voice. It was his voice.
And did you see his writing style, his expertise, his ability as a writer change?
Oh, yes. I think Steve will probably be happy to, speak to that in our session afterwards if you want to talk to him. But definitely, don't you think, Steve, he really just, and the words that you heard tonight are just some of the essays. They're really, at times, quite moving. We didn't write, I used to sit there, I'm telling you, this is like really crazy, because I would sit there and I'd be typing away and the tears would be running down my neck and in my shirt, and I'd be saying, stop. And he said, oh, that was supposed to be bright and cheery. And I'm saying, Neil, stop it, so.
What did it teach you working with Neil, knowing that you were now close to somebody who shared something so personal with you, his journey?
It was very unlike anything I'd ever experienced because it was a very unique experience. I just can't remember something that was so forcefully but quietly engaging. And it became a space, a quiet space, where sometimes it just felt like there were just our minds there. And his body just disappeared. It became inconsequential. It didn't matter if he was in a chair or if he could walk or if he could talk. We just got into this zone-like kind of space. And, you know, this was a very active, happy household. And sort of around the fringe, you could see Rima going over there to get the chocolate-covered almonds, and Hannah would be in there cooking Thanksgiving dinner, and the girls would be going back and forth to the kitchen. The dog was running around. But in the middle of that, we were sort of just there working. And it was like we had closed off a certain amount of the area just for creativity. It was a really wonderful feeling.
Right, because you had said, which is interesting, you said, I didn't know him before his disability, but
Right.
you really did know him because he was not his disability, and I think you
That's
understood
right.
that.
You
So,
know,
so
it was
clearly.
just not important.
Yeah.
I mean, he was so alive and so full. His life was so full that none of that other inconvenience was there while we were working. I mean, certainly it was there the other 22 hours of that day and for the rest of the week. But I think, you know, I gave him a cup once that had a picture of a bird cage with an open door, and the bird was flying away. And I just felt like if there was one thing that I could give him, it would be reflective of that image, you know, that he wasn't in a cage, you know.
Any other questions? Yes, thank you. No, you.
Is narrative medicine limited to the diagnosed person, or is it something that you can involve the family in as well?
I think narrative medicine is an experience that anyone can participate in and gain from greatly. It's not limited to medicine. It's used in all sorts of different venues. It's a great teaching tool. It's used in kids with chronic illness. It's used in kids who are delinquent. It's used in prisons. It's used in medical schools. Now Hofstra has one of the first programs that's incorporating it in all 4 years of their curriculum. At Columbia, there are workshops open to anyone. You might want to think about taking one of the workshops there. It's just an amazing experience.
I think that to add to what Dana said, everybody in this room knows everything there is to know about health and illness. We all have experiences of our family members getting sick, our family members in good health, our family members in not so good health. And that's what the narrative is, the story of the pain and the happiness and the suffering and the frustration, and telling that story, at least in a very specific way, whether it's writing or using art to tell the story, and then to share that story is a way to open the door to a discussion about what's really going on. And I think that's, Pat, you might want to say something about that, but for me, that's an important part of the narrative.
And it's not limited to people who have a chronic illness or, you know, I'm absolutely perfectly healthy in every way. And I just get so much out of these sessions that it's amazing.
Okay, why don't we start with you in the back?
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and for sharing so much of your experiences with Neil. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your comments concerning Neil's bodily experiences. And in hearing all of you read Neil's writings, in addition to the narrative perspective, I hear a very strong phenomenological orientation in his writings because they're so descriptive. So I wanted to ask you, to what extent did you see or did you share or observe that Neil's bodily experiences were transformative for him in terms of fueling his agency?
That's a good question. You know, he wrote a lot about what it was like in a typical day, which expanded in time and effort, as he mentioned in one of his stories. And he was not shy about the graphic nature of what he had to do to survive, and weighing the balance of when it would become intolerable to him. And I think that was a constant I don't want to use the word, well, I guess struggle in his mind to know when he would have it at the exact point of decision making. And I think that the burden of that was much greater for him than the physical aspects. But as I said before, I never knew him as an able-bodied person. I know of his able-bodiedness since I know how physically active he was. And so the transformation through the stories into this new body form for him, I think, was one thing that made it tolerable. I'm not sure I'm getting to your question, but I think that the writing is transformative in the sense that when you tell the story of what you're experiencing, it allows you not just to release it and explore it, but also transform it for yourself into something that's able to be incorporated into your sense of yourself. He was expanding so much in his mind as his body was getting smaller that I think it was just a gradual transition for him. And I think he dealt with it so successfully. I mean, he took the most, you know, food was a big issue for him. We didn't get to read his essay about food, which is one of my favorites, but he really hated the idea of being fed through a tube because he loved food. I mean, he loved food. He could name every meal he ever ate, and he goes into that in great detail in one of the essays. But what struck me when I was typing it was that instead of sitting there and grumbling and being miserable and unhappy, and he decided instead that every time he got a peg tube feeding, that he would close his eyes and remember one of his favorite meals. And I was absolutely overcome with that concept, because who would ever be that creative to challenge yourself to find a way of eating that was so just so abhorrent to him, and yet turn it into something creative and positive? I mean, just phenomenal. Maybe not phenomenological, but phenomenal.
Yeah. Good way out of that one.
Yeah.
Next question. Somebody over here.
I don't really have a question. It's just more of a
Good.
overall. My name is Chris Curtin, and I am the president of the board of Heimbold. And I have
more questions, comments, stories? Yes.
A question for Dr. Gage on her medical practice. I'm finding myself wanting to understand a little bit more about you and about how this process changed you specifically as a physician. You mentioned in one of your essays you're a physician, but you're not his physician. To what extent were you able to maintain that boundary that you set out? Did you find yourself preoccupied by basic science? Did you find yourself reading up in areas that you normally wouldn't read up on? Do you find yourself in your practice when someone's having a peg planted, describing how they can enjoy a meal in the future based on the idea you got? So I'm just wondering, how this changed you.
I think that when I first went into this, I thought, no problem. I'll just go there and type, and I like to write, so it'll be interesting. And Neil and I used to say if we'd met before, we probably would have hated each other. And I'm not crazy about Bruce Springsteen either. And we did argue back and forth, but just like normal people. But I had some very difficult times putting this into perspective for myself as a physician, as well as a civilian, if you will. And I sought advice about it because I thought, at times I became like really obsessed with, well, what are we going to do next week, and are we going to get this finished, and what do I say now, and should I ask him this, or I really don't think he spelled tracheostomy right, and I was really just, it's Monday, I got 2 more days to wait, and so it really took on this very strange obsession almost of, how do I do this? It was unlike anything I had been trained for, unlike anything I had ever experienced before. His circumstances were so different. I was a physician, I wasn't a physician, I was a writer, I wasn't a writer, I was a typist, I couldn't spell that good, he kept correcting me, it was just like all these things going around and around. And I finally did what I usually do when I'm faced with a situation like that. I retreat into fact. And so I bought every ALS book I could find, and everyone that had been written by someone with ALS or who knew somebody with ALS, and I read his doctor's book, and I found that by giving myself more knowledge, I'd always had an interest in neurology anyway, and I had studied with some neuroanatomists, so I had done some, microscopic work, and I'd had neurology, patients. But this was really beyond any of what we usually experience as physicians. I think nurses are much closer with patients than doctors are, social workers are, writing teachers are, family members are. We only see the tip of things. So I really had to do a lot of work about this. But you're right. I mean, the things that I learned from Neil will stay with me. And I talk about him all the time. I've used several of his essays to give narrative medicine sessions to medical staff, and I'm going to continue to do that. So I think his message is a huge one, and it's so brilliantly presented that I think there's a room for that going forward. I think Maura had a question. Can you just stand up and tell everybody where you're from? Yay! And the neutral thing lasted for about 10 minutes. Yeah, it really didn't work at all.
Do you think that it was important for Neil that you were a physician?
Absolutely.
Can
You know, he said in his thing that he was a egalitarian but an elitist, and every time he wrote my name down, it was Dr. Dana Gage. It was never just Dana or my writing assistant. So I think that there was a bit of him, I don't know, Rima, what do you think? That he just kind of got a kick out of that.
Then what about me? Like, what, you know, I don't have that postgraduate degree. I don't know. I'm not so sure that.
I think it was amusing, actually. It was weird, I think.
I mean, I think he liked the fact that you were getting a degree in narrative medicine at Columbia.
Yeah, he loved Columbia.
He was like a fifth generation, right? Columbia?
No, first generation.
Oh, he's
First
the first
generation. He
generation.
was so proud to be coming out of the Columbia family, and in fact got this very wonderful award. Do you want to speak to that?
Alumni medal in May, presented in May at commencement. To about 9 or 10 people who have worked different aspects of the alumni community in Columbia. And he wasn't able to go. At first, we thought he would go to get the award, accept the award, but it became a logistical nightmare. So the girls and I went, and I accepted the award. And there's going to be a dinner on Saturday night to further honor the medalist, and it's his birthday.
Aw.
There were no coincidences in Neil's life.
Can I just want to reach this out to Neil's daughter and ask you whether you've written about any of your experiences, your stories with your dad?
Have I written about
Yeah.
it? Yeah, I just finished a 370-page manuscript.
That's all?
Yeah, I got a master's in writing, actually, in 2005. So we were always, I'll say, worthy competitors. And I did a lot of editing for him, of this collection of essays. I sat down with him on Tuesday and actually went through all of it with him. And it was a good sounding board for him, and I think he was always a good sounding board for me. There's been a lot of writing about him.
What are you going to do with it?
My manuscript.
Okay. To be continued. We'll have you come talk about it next time. Anybody else? Any comments? Julie?
Dana, would you seek out a similar experience again?
Absolutely. It can never be the same, you know, but I think we all have this in us to do something like this. And, you know, at first it seems like it must be a very scary experience. And for people who aren't in the medical field, maybe it's even scarier, or maybe it's easier. I'm not sure. But what you get from receiving this story is so much more than you can ever imagine. And just being in the presence of someone who is going through an experience like this is just so enriching. You know, there was never a time when it felt burdensome or annoying or isn't it time to leave yet? Or, I mean, it was just two people getting together to help, you know, create a story that otherwise wouldn't be told. And I just can't imagine anything more fulfilling than that. So I would encourage everyone to call up anybody you know with ALS and say, hey, you want to write your story? I'll help you. Yes?
I think that what I've seen from Neil's family and what I've heard tonight, that he was an incredible person. And he brought a constellation of incredible attributes that allowed him to have such a beautiful voice in a way that is now being able to be shared with all of us and will go on, you know, to many years to come. And having taken care of people over the years,
All right, I wrote the essays myself, okay?
I understand what you're saying. I agree with you. I was blown away when we did a narrative workshop at Columbia with a whole bunch of physicians and other non-physicians, but 8 of us from, and I was just blown away by everybody's ability to write their story. Even a prompt such as, like, what's your name, brings out a story. Everyone, you're right, has a story. And I think that what we're all saying here is to allow somebody we care about to tell their story and to listen.
I think it's also whether or not they want their story heard or not heard,
Of course,
and also how they want it
absolutely.
to be told.
Right, Neil wanted somebody who was gonna just,
Obviously had a gift, and that gift,
Right.
I think, is what's gonna, I hope it's gonna carry on to many more ALS patients, to advocate them to wanna tell their stories. Whereas maybe as some people in the past that were, were literally losing their voice first before they lost other parts of their body, couldn't do that. And I think that narrative medicine carries into so many other aspects of people, like you said tonight, that are suffering from illnesses. I have an 80-year-old father that is debilitated with Parkinson's. My father's first generation Irish Catholic. He's not going to would never get up on that stage and tell you his story. You know what I mean? He's got great stories to tell about his journey, but he would never tell it. And I don't think he'd ever want someone else to tell it for him. Maybe after he passed away, I could actually tell the story. If you get what I'm trying to say. Everybody's got a different journey and how they want that story to be told. And I think in Neil's particular case, I think he's a pioneer in what we're going forward in narrative medicine, and hopefully we're going to be able, through these stories, when they get published, to be able to help so many people that are going through this journey that didn't really ever, they felt alone. They felt that they didn't know that there was someone else out there that actually felt that. And the same day that they felt that they couldn't, to me, what resonates is when Neil's in his bed looking out the window. Those kinds of stories.
yes.
I think that many people think that they don't have a special voice, so they don't think people care until they're asked. And so I think it is really important with narrative medicine for people, even if it's because some people, they don't want their story to be told to the public, but they want to be able to tell their story to someone to share it. So I think that's something that is important to think about.
Thank you.
It was my joy to introduce this evening, and I'm sorry to be the have to one to bring some of us to a close, but I want to thank Steve Lewis, Heidi Weiss, Ree McGrath, Jamie Talon, and Dana Gage for sharing their experiences with us this evening and for bringing this extraordinary collaboration to fruition, really. And I'm also delighted to announce that Dana Gage has agreed to work with the Mac Angels Foundation to create a series of narrative medicine workshops to assist people whose lives are impacted by ALS to use literature to gain new insight and meaning into their experience. We are finalizing the details, and if this is something that you would be interested in learning about when we have the specifics as when and where, we have a sheet outside with the representatives from Mac Angels, and if you leave your contact information, we will be sure to let you know when those details are finalized. And now I'd like to invite everybody to join us outside the theater for a reception in the lobby area. We have some refreshments, and you can meet tonight's presenters more intimately. We also have representatives from our sponsoring organizations, the Mac Angels Foundation, the Westchester End of Life Coalition, the Health Advocacy Program at Sarah Lawrence, the Writing Institute at Sarah Lawrence, the Program in Narrative Medicine, as well as Pathways to Care and the Muscular Dystrophy Association ALS Division, and they'll be happy to tell you more about these incredible organizations and how they are assisting patients and caregivers and people affected by illness. So thank you all so much for coming, and